There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello, BookTube. I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with my first In Other Words of 2019. In Other Words is an occasional series that I started last fall, where I talk about interesting vocabulary, idioms, language patterns that I encounter in my reading. And every so often I want to make sure everybody understands that I am not holding myself up to be an expert in these matters. I just like this kind of thing, and I like doing deep dives on the internet to find out what it all means and where it all came from. But despite the fact that I am fairly well educated and am an English teacher here in Japan by profession, I am by no means an expert on what I'm talking about. This is just quite amateur research, and I look forward to any comments or corrections in the comment section below. So I have perhaps 10 or so pieces of vocabulary to talk to you about tonight, and they come from two recent reads or bales. The first one is this American novel published in 1974, The Half-Sisters by Cynthia Proper Seton. This was a disappointing read, but I did read the whole novel. Her earlier novel, the one just published just before this, The Sea Change of Angela Lewis, was a wonderful, wonderful novel with flaws that didn't deter me from absolutely loving it, whereas the flaws just overwhelmed this one. But doesn't matter, there was still some great expressions in here, so we're going to tell you about quite a few of those, and then just a few from William Golding's 1964 novel, The Spire, which was so awful that there was a group buddy read with 4 buddy readers, and 3 of us bailed. But before I bailed, I got a little bit of vocabulary that I want to tell you about. Without further ado, let's get started. As Britta Bowler remarked in a recent comment, that's one thing bad books might be good for, is still giving us new words to learn. So let's accentuate the positive, shall we? The first word from The Half-Sisters is the mother of one of the protagonists. Erica's mother is, despite this being the story starting in the mid-1940s, she is a professional art historian at a university, and she's fiercely independent. She was a wonderful character that was underdeveloped in the novel, I thought. But early in her academic career made a point, we learn on page 28, of hunting up limner's portraits in Vermont. So limner, what the hell's that? Limner is a archaic and not very common word that means a painter, especially a painter of portraits or miniatures. This is an American novel, but it goes back to, it's related etymologically to the word illumination, limner, illumination, and a limner was originally a illuminator of manuscripts. You know, those old fabulous books, those illuminated manuscripts. And then after that era, what was that, the Renaissance, maybe before, medieval, I think, era, a limner was just a more general painter of ornamental decoration. But in the slightly more modern era, it was a portraitist or a miniaturist. Now, I kind of remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but the recently retired, what is her name, Michiko Kakutani of, I'm pronouncing it the Japanese way, I wonder how you Americans pronounce her name. Michiko Kakutani, I don't know, but Michiko Kakutani, the head book reviewer in the book section of the New York Times, she used limn a lot in her reviews. Do you remember that? Now, which makes me think another one of her favorite words was liminal, which is a word that I don't think anybody on the planet really knows what it means. So let's double check liminal. Is it related to liminal, to the point that anybody uses it correctly, refers in some way to a threshold. And Kakutani just, I don't think she ever wrote a review that I ever read that didn't have the word liminal in it. But it comes from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. So I don't think it's related to limb. So okay, that's a digression. Don't want to confuse anybody. So the verb limn, L-I-M-N, means, the first meaning in the dictionary is to draw or paint. Second is to outline in clear, sharp detail, delineate, or the third meaning is describe. For example, the novel Limns the Frontier Life of the Settlers. I think it's a word we don't need. It doesn't roll trippingly off the tongue. But a limner was a portraitist. So yeah, it does come from the Latin illuminare, which means to illuminate. Shakespeare, in his poem Venus and Adonis, look when a painter would surpass the life in limning out a well-proportioned steed. All right, moving from the sublime to the slutty, let's talk about my next word from this novel, floozy. I know what this word means, but I just thought this was a good chance to talk about it. It's a promiscuous woman, right? Spelled any number of ways. I'll put them up here in a list. Nobody's quite sure of the etymology. Etymologists think it might be a variation of flossy, which was 1890 slang that meant fancy or frilly or fluffy. A dictionary published around the year 1700 talked about Florence as a slang word for a wench that is tousled and ruffled. They think that might somehow have given birth to the word floozy. So going back to flossy and the connection that they think might exist between flossy and floozy, in the mid-19th century, flossy acquired two new figurative meanings, because floss, which, filaments of fibers, cotton candy, but it came to mean more figuratively fancy or showy on the one hand, or saucy or impertinent on the other. And that does kind of, you can see how that would degenerate into a very sexist word for sexually liberated woman, but of course they would have derided her as being sexually promiscuous. And the research that I did compared it to the word hussy, same meaning, that derived from housewife. So these meanings often start like the word queen, which then came to mean a prostitute, and then came to mean an effeminate gay man, but that started out with a very positive meaning. Housewife degenerated into floozy. Flossy to floozy is a little bit more of a stretch, but still interesting. The next word, it's actually an expression. One character says to another in the novel, "You have a lot of crust." I'd never heard that, and it is very rare, but it means exactly the same thing as to have a lot of gall or a lot of nerve. And it's been in American English since around 1900. There's no real good explanation for how that phrase came to have that meaning. Do you know? Have you ever heard it? To have a lot of gall, to have a lot of nerve, very, very common, very familiar to me. But to have a lot of crust, which has the same meaning, I'd never heard that before. Similarly, this one is interesting. I'll quote the actual sentence later because Cynthia Proper Seton uses it in a very different way than it's defined, or a slightly different way. The word is gangle. Gangle is a verb which I'd never heard. I know gangly now that I think of it. Gangly? Okay, that fits totally, because gangle means to move ungracefully. You're walking, your gait, you walk kind of in a ridiculous, ungraceful way. You are gangling. But gangly, I know. I didn't think of that until now, after all my research. Because, yeah, gangly describes a boy or a young man who moves on gracefully, awkwardly, and is very tall and thin. Now that I knew, but gangle, the verb, the way that she uses it in this novel is the protagonist Erica's talking about her kind of boyfriend, and she can't dismiss him. And this is the sentence: "It was not easy to dismiss Ryan, that long gangle." So I think she's just referring to him by the way that he was kind of an awkward guy, so she's calling him a gangle. I didn't find any reference to it used in exactly that same way, but it's obvious that that's the meaning she's ascribing to him, and she's creating a noun to describe his awkward way of walking or his awkward personality. The next two are very rare, but I think they're very useful words. So there are a lot of political discussions in this novel, and they're not done all that well, which was one of the things I didn't like about it. But I did encounter the word trimmer for the political meaning, and a trimmer is somebody who adapts their views to the prevailing political trends for personal advancement. The Republican Congress, perhaps? This meaning of trim goes back to the late 17th century, and it comes from the nautical meaning of trim, which I didn't know. Nautically, trim means to adjust the balance of sails or yards. I didn't look up what yards mean, but I can understand it. To adjust the balance of sails or yards with reference to the wind's direction. So, great metaphor for somebody who changes their opinions according to the prevailing political winds. But now, the political meaning. Have you ever heard it used in this way? It's a great word, and boy, we need it in the era of Trump. Hey? Trump was a trimmer who changed from being an asshole Democrat into being a fascist Republican because he was trimming. And then the congressman followed suit. The next one I'm not sure how to pronounce. It comes from the French, and I didn't find any help online. And it's an extremely rare word, but I still think we should revive it. A jusquaboutist. Jusquaboutist. And that is a person who advocates carrying on a conflict until the bitter end, until a conclusive victory is won, or until all of one's goals have been achieved. A jusquaboutist. It dates from only from the early 20th century. It was first found in the journal The New Statesman. It comes from the French. I couldn't find any useful information about how the French fit into the English, but I would be interested to learn more if you know it. This one is a word that I knew full well what the meaning was, but it gave me a chance to really think about why does it mean that? And the word is untoward. So I found a lot about that. So the first thing to think about, untoward means undesirable, not proper, not polite. And so toward means in the direction of me or in the direction of something. So untoward in the opposite direction, what's the connection? But it has a different nuance. So the first thing that I found out is that going back to Old English, toward comes from the Old English word that has an E after the W, toward, a combination of two words from Old English, to and weird or weird, which came from German, and the German meaning was to turn, and has come down through the centuries to mean in the direction of or homeward. Usually used in English as a preposition that describes either position, he kept his back toward me, motion, we drove toward home, or some kind of figurative process. I had $12 toward the mortgage payment. But it's the adjectival meaning where untoward grew out of. The adjective meaning was, in the 18th century, early 18th century, was describing somebody who was willing to learn or was compliant, or of things that were favorable or propitious. So making progress, moving toward a goal, toward. The adjective. We don't use that now, but that's where it came from. So out of those positive meanings, untoward developed around the same time. So somebody who doesn't show an inclination or aptitude for something, somebody who is difficult to manage, unruly or perverse, or awkward, unlucky, or not graceful. All of that kind of morphed into the modern meaning, which is unseemly or improper. From 1658, they came to a very wicked man's house, where they had very untoward entertainment. Oh my. In addition to the modern meanings that I mentioned, it can mean unruly, unlucky, not favorable, improper. And of course, this is a good chance to mention that toward with no S is more common in American English, and towards with an S is more common in British English. And Canadians, we are so schizophrenic about our historical links to Britain and our proximity to America. We do both with abandon. Okay, here is maybe the most interesting one. I mean, I don't think this has any usefulness in our daily lives other than for your next turkey dinner. But there is mention in here of the oyster in the spine of the turkey, and I went, what? And it's a thing, people! Do you know about the oyster in the spine of a turkey? I won't even try to pronounce the French word, but let's see if Google will help. Here is what the internet, this is how the internet says this French word, which is up here, is pronounced, which has the same meaning, an oyster of the spine of a turkey.
Sot-l'y-laisse.
Sot-l'y-laisse, huh?
Sot-l'y-laisse.
It's got a lot of dashes and apostrophes, but anyway, so the spine of the oyster in a spine of a turkey, and the French translates to the fool leaves it there. In other words, it's the most delectable part of the turkey, and I never heard of it, and I love turkey. It's the meat within a small spoon-like bone nestled between the thigh and the spine of a turkey, and apparently it's the real deal. It's the turkiest part of turkey meat. Can't wait to go home at Christmas next year and try it. It's really tender, really fatty, and it's just la pièce de résistance. And Cynthia Proper Seton, who she has a flair for language and she occasionally descends into needlessly abstruse language, but I thought this one was well done. She reunites with her half-sister's husband, who she herself had lost her virginity to 30 or 40 years before, 30 years before, I think. And they're having a very animated conversation. And she is she is watching his body language and watching his face as he talks. And this is the sentence. She watched the pulse beat at his temple while he talked and found it curiously touching. And it made her think of the oyster in the spine of a turkey, which was even more curious. Can you visualize the pulse beating at his temple resembling that? I don't know. But anyway, sure made me curious to try a turkey spine oyster. That's it for Proper Seton's novel, The Half-Sisters. Let's move on to just 3 more expressions from William Golding's The Spire, which was a really boring book, but had a few good words. The mind-numbingly boring theme of this book was that a cathedral was being built. So there's tools and architectural terms, and I've got 2 of those. The first one is adze, which is a cutting tool that looks a little bit like an axe. And this here's some pictures. It goes back to the Stone Age. It's also used to refer to any tool with a sharp cutting edge. An adze is used for smoothing or carving wood in hand woodworking, and the cutting edge is perpendicular to the handle. So maybe you can see that in the pictures. Next is wattle and daub. I knew daub, the verb, and I think daub and dab are related. Yeah, the more modern word is dab, D-A-B, but daub is older, and they're basically the same, although dab has other meanings. But to apply something lightly, like lotion or clay or something to something, dab or daub. But wattle and daub, very much related to that. That is a building material going way back, centuries back, to build walls. And it consists of 2 things. The wattle is the network of interwoven sticks. Here's a picture so you can see the wattle. The wattle is the interwoven sticks, and the daub is the mud or clay that covers it. Okay, so wattle and daub. Wattle comes from a Proto-Germanic word that dates back to words that in the Proto-Indo-European language meant weave. Daub comes from French, meaning dressing, adorning, whitening thoroughly, but it means in more recent times to smear with soft adhesive matter, to plaster or whitewash a wall. So daub, wattle and daub. And the last one is really interesting. I found a really curious use of the verb surprise in this novel. So in a way I can't make head nor tail of it, so I'm eager for your input, but it sounds so weird to me. So here's the sentence, and the he is the protagonist. What is his name? Dean Jocelyn. And he is talking to the sacrist, and a sacrist, which is your bonus word for the day, is a more old-fashioned word for sexton, somebody who has charge of the contents of the church, especially the sacred vessels and vestments. But here, look at the way that the verb surprise is used in this sentence. He looked back at the sacrist, and surprised on his face an ambiguity of kindness and amused malice. What does that mean, surprised? I'm assuming that it means, and was surprised to see on his face. So this is how I'm interpreting the sentence, but if you have another interpretation, but I've never heard the verb surprise used this way. But I think it means he looked back at the sacrist and was surprised to see on his face an ambiguity of kindness and amused malice. But I've never seen surprise used that way. So, I need your input. Is there another interpretation? Have you ever seen this kind of a grammatical pattern for surprise used as an intransitive verb followed by that prepositional phrase, surprised on his face? The transitive meaning of surprise is I surprised him, means he was surprised. I surprised him. But I don't think there's an intransitive meaning. Surprise without an object. Please, explain it to me. I'm at my wit's end. which isn't saying much. All right, well, that's what I've got. If you have any comments, corrections, thoughts, please leave them in the comment section below. Thanks for watching.